Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers driver identifications, reasonable suspicion, and loitering, and is brought to us by Rogue Nation's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On August 4th, 2020, Auditor News Now South Florida, who we will refer to as Mr. News, was driving a vehicle in Ware County, Georgia, near Ware State Prison. Upon seeing roadblocks near the prison and believing that he could not get through, Mr. News turned around in a nearby driveway and pulled to the side of the road to review a map. When several police officers, including Trooper McLean of the Georgia State Patrol, pulled up behind them, Major Lee Awesome from Rogue Nation, who was a passenger in Mr. News's vehicle, began to film the encounter.
Hi.
Everything all right, sir?
Yeah, I was checking out something out on the map.
Okay, all right. You do realize you stopped back there?
Yeah, we thought we could get through. Then we saw we couldn't, so we turned around.
All right. You got your driver's license with you?
I do. Am I getting pulled over for something?
Well, you pulled into the warden's driveway back there.
To turn around.
Yeah, and we're trying to figure out what you were doing. We're trying to identify you.
Is that illegal?
How's my ID going to tell you what I'm doing?
Well, we're trying to identify you.
Okay.
For what?
May I please have your driver's license?
Is that a lawful order?
Yes, sir.
What infraction do you believe I've
committed?
committed?
You pulled over here on the road, and I checked that.
Because I was going to look at the map. I didn't want to get on my cellular device
Well, that's good.
while I was driving.
Well, that's good. I appreciate it. Do you have your driver's license?
I have my driver's license with me, but I'm not certain I'm required to give it. Can you state some sort of statute or
Yes, sir.
some sort of infraction?
Anytime you're requested by law enforcement to provide driver's license, you have to provide your driver's license.
If you've committed some sort of infraction or
You turn
crime.
around back there.
Is that illegal?
Was that illegal?
And you pulled in, so we're trying to figure out what
Was
you're
that
doing
illegal?
down there. We were trying to figure out.
I understand that.
We're trying to figure out what you're doing there.
But you're not to figure out what I'm doing, police. You're the law enforcement, police.
And that we're trying to figure out. It's suspicious. So we're just trying to figure out what you were doing down
Is
there.
one
You
of
have
your,
your driver's
is
license?
one of these cars your supervisor?
Yes, sir, it is.
I'd like
but
to talk to your supervisor,
You're going
please.
to talk to me right now. And do you have your driver's license?
I'm not. I don't think I'm required to give you my driver's license, and I'd like to talk to your supervisor to find out.
Yes, sir. May I please get your driver's license?
I don't believe you're giving me a lawful command, sir.
Yes, I am, sir.
For what purpose do you need my ID? What crime or ordinance do you suspect me to have broken?
Because it was suspicious of you to pull
Suspicious,
into
is
the driveway
that a
and back up
misdemeanor or
and
is that a
pull back
felony?
this way.
Is that a misdemeanor or a felony?
That's articulable reasonable suspicion that you were
Of what
doing
crime?
something. That you were loitering or something like that. Do you have
Do you have
driver's
evidence
license?
that I was loitering?
Sir, you pulled in back there, did you not?
I turned around, yeah, because I saw that I couldn't get through.
You
That's
couldn't get
correct.
through. The road was open. I don't know.
Oh, I
where
saw.
you-
It looked like there was checkpoints for getting into the prison or something. So we turned around because we didn't think we could get through.
As you can see from our plate, we're not from here,
Yeah.
so
I
yeah.
understand that. Do you have your driver's license?
I don't. I'm telling you. Am I lawfully required to give you my ID?
Yes, sir. Yes,
what?
sir.
What? For what purposes am I lawfully required?
What I just explained to you, sir.
Suspicion isn't a crime, and I didn't break any
Articulable
ordinance.
reasonable suspicion, yes.
Of
a crime.
Of a
Articulable
crime.
reasonable suspicion that you turn around back
Can
there
I just
doing
talk to the
something.
supervisor that's back there?
No, sir. I need your driver's license.
Trooper McLean claims that citizens are required to identify themselves whenever an officer requests that they do so. As we have discussed many times on ATA, officers cannot order individuals to provide identification at their discretion. But during a traffic stop, officers are typically within their authority to demand the driver's license. Section 40-5-29 of the Georgia Code requires drivers to have their licenses in their immediate possession at all times when operating a motor vehicle and to display their licenses upon the demand of a law enforcement officer. And Section 40-1-1 defines an operator as, quote, any person who drives or is in actual physical control of a motor vehicle. In the 1999 case of Wynn versus State, the Georgia Court of Appeals held that an individual was in violation of Georgia's open container law, which prohibits possessing an open container of any alcoholic beverage while operating a vehicle, when they were merely sitting in their vehicle on the side of the road and were not seen driving the vehicle. The court reasoned that, quote, the term operating a vehicle includes being in actual physical control of the vehicle, regardless of whether the vehicle is driven. Given this analysis, it is likely that a court would conclude that Mr. News was operating the vehicle at the time the officer approached him and was consequently required to provide his driver's license to the officer if a traffic stop was justified. However, in the 1979 case of Delaware versus Prowse, the Supreme Court held that officers cannot randomly stop vehicles to check if the drivers are licensed, asserting that, quote, except in those situations in which there is at least articulable and reasonable suspicion that a motorist is unlicensed or that an automobile is not registered, or that either the vehicle or an occupant is otherwise subject to seizure for violation of law, stopping an automobile and detaining the driver in order to check his driver's license are unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment. Therefore, if Mr. News was charged with a violation of Section 40-5-29 for refusing to present his driver's license, he could challenge the constitutionality of the stop and likely get the case dismissed if the court agreed that Trooper McLean did not have the reasonable suspicion necessary to detain him. We will discuss the constitutionality of the stop later in this episode, but for now, it's sufficient to note that drivers do not lose their Fourth Amendment rights simply because they're operating a motor vehicle, and that officers cannot demand that drivers identify themselves without reasonable suspicion of a traffic violation or criminal activity.
I'm done answering questions.
All right, sir. I'm gonna have you step out of the vehicle for me, sir.
For what purpose?
Step out of the vehicle, sir. I just need to identify you.
But
and that's
for what
all.
purpose?
You're making it harder. All I'm trying to do.
I'm trying to make it lawful.
All I'm trying to do.
What law do you think I broke to pull me over for?
You were down there. You pulled into the.
Yes,
I
I
didn't
did.
know what you were doing, right?
I turned around.
That's the
I told you
warden's
what I'm
residence. That's the warden's residence.
I turned
State
around.
Property,
I didn't
right?
know whose it was.
It's state property. So I came
So
down
it's
here
public
to identify.
property.
That's state property. Okay.
Public property then.
That's state property. Okay.
Was
So-
it illegal to turn around on his property?
Well, it's articulably reasonable suspicious that you're performing something
A turnaround
illegal there,
in a
or
vehicle.
you're doing something there when we have other things going on. So if I can please
I'm
identify
not
you,
from
sir.
this town.
Okay, and that's fine. And all I have to do is identify you. We can get you on your way.
How is identifying me going to tell you what I was doing?
Well, we're making sure that you're not a wanted person. You're somebody that was going to go there and harm the warden or something.
The ID is not
I'm
going to
making
tell you
a
that.
formal request for your supervisor right
Okay,
now.
well that's fine, sir.
I'm formally
but-
making a request
and
right now for your
I'm making a
supervisor.
formal request that you provide your driver's license. Go ahead, step out.
I'm trying to get
Step
identified,
back
and I
here.
don't think I need to.
Step back here.
For what reason?
Step back here.
What
Step
did
back
he
here.
explain? He explained that I turned around in someone's driveway. Yes, I did.
Okay,
I don't
so
know whose
turn
driveway
this-
was.
Stop and listen. You asked
Sir.
me a question. I'm telling you exactly what I'm
I
telling
don't. Is it unlawful to turn around in a driveway?
you. Let me explain to
Go
you.
ahead.
so I get where I'm going.
Go ahead.
All right. Currently, there's been events happening there at the prison, correct?
I don't know. I'm from. You can see I'm from
All right,
Florida.
so we're-
Okay. So this is what's going on.
Okay.
There's been events that's happened there at the prison in the last week. All right.
I didn't know
now
that.
We have an incident going on right now.
I didn't know that
Now,
either.
You pulled into the warden's driveway. Now you're leaving.
I pulled
So
into
we
a
have-
driveway. I didn't know whose driveway it was.
figure out what's
Wasn't
going on.
posted for trespassing.
If you will
I made
hand
sure
your
to
phone
look.
to your buddy, he can record with both phones, but you're going to step out here and we're going to try to identify you.
Is this a lawful request for
Yes.
my ID?
That is correct.
Can you tell me what lawful statute or
Sir, step
of
out.
what?
Get out.
My wallet's down there, so I can get you my ID from down there.
Can you
I'm
grab
not
your
gonna have
wallet
you
from
get
right
it.
there? Can you grab? I was
I
pointing
can't
at
see
it.
it.
It's right there. That's why I was pointing at it. You think that?
Okay,
it's
so I'm going to identify myself.
Let me see your
I'm going to
driver's
identify myself, but I am going to make sure to follow through with this because I don't believe it's
By
lawful.
all means, please,
Okay.
sir.
So
I'm
you're-
not telling you. I'm not telling
So
you.
you're
you
right, just for the record, you're identifying me right now for what purpose?
can't. Like I told you.
Because
you
you're suspicious.
turned
Because I'm
around.
suspicious.
Yes, you turned around. You don't know everything that has happened.
I don't
recently.
know anything that's
Okay,
happened. I'm not
so
from here.
I'm going to explain it to you once I'm able to identify you.
The officers explained that they became suspicious when Mr. News turned around in the warden's personal driveway because of certain incidents that have been occurring at the nearby prison. They are likely referring to a riot that occurred at Ware State Prison 3 days before this incident, during which 2 staff members and 3 inmates were injured, a golf cart was set on fire, and several windows were broken. While turning around in someone's driveway generally is not against the law, it could give an officer reasonable suspicion to conduct a traffic stop under certain circumstances. For instance, in the 2004 case of Gary versus State, the Court of Appeals of Georgia determined that reasonable suspicion to conduct a traffic stop existed when a driver made a hard stop to turn into a private driveway located just short of a roadblock, and an officer suspected they were trying to avoid the traffic checkpoint. The court explained that, quote, abnormal or unusual actions taken to avoid a roadblock may give an officer a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, even when the evasive action is not illegal. By contrast, completely normal driving, even if it incidentally evades the roadblock, does not justify a Terry-type stop. Although the officers did not mention anything about suspecting Mr. News of attempting to avoid the roadblock, reasonable suspicion is an objective standard. And, as the Supreme Court held in the 1996 case of Wren versus United States, the constitutional reasonableness of a traffic stop does not depend on the actual subjective motivations of the individual officers involved. Accordingly, a court could conclude that the fact that Mr. News turned around in a driveway upon seeing the roadblock was sufficient to justify a traffic stop if the manner in which he turned around was considered to be abnormal or unusual driving. It's also important to note that even though Mr. News was unaware of the prison riot, the officers were permitted to take the riot into account when determining whether reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. News existed. As the Supreme Court stated in the 1996 case of Ornelas versus United States, quote, "The principal components of a determination of reasonable suspicion or probable cause will be the events which occurred leading up to the stop or search, and then the decision whether these historical facts, viewed from the standpoint of an objectively reasonable police officer, amount to reasonable suspicion or to probable cause." Because reasonable suspicion and probable cause are determined from the officer's perspective, it is important for citizens to remember that there may be instances when they can be lawfully detained despite the fact that they are not aware of any evidence that they have committed an offense.
I'm going to explain it to you once I'm able to identify it.
Okay. So you're identifying me for suspicious behavior.
Yes, sir.
And that's not a misdemeanor nor a felony.
It is. It would
nor
be.
have I committed a traffic infraction.
We don't know what you're doing. But honestly,
This isn't going to tell you what I'm doing. But so, just for the record, I have not made a traffic infraction, correct? Correct. I was
all
turning
right.
around.
So
It's
I'm
a
coming down
normal
here. I've
practice.
informed you.
Yes.
When I initially informed you, when I asked for your driver's license, you asked for the reason. I informed you whose driveway that was.
Which I asked, was that unlawful?
All right.
And you said,
Yes,
it's
I'm
state
trying to
property.
I'm trying to figure out because of the
My
events
ID is
that
going to
occurred.
make it yes or not
Yes, sir.
unlawful?
Yes, sir.
My
Let
ID
me
is going to
see- let
change
me see
whether
your
it's
driver's
lawful or
license.
not.
Yes, sir.
If
you
you're
can't be arrested.
If
You
you're
can't.
asking for it, I'm going to say no. If you're requesting it, requiring it by law,
I am requiring
under
it by law.
threat of arrest, then I will.
I
then
am
will do
requiring it by law. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I am going to get arrested if I don't ID myself.
There is state law that says when you're requested by
That's a
law
yes or
enforcement.
no?
Yes,
Okay.
if you're required by law enforcement, you must provide your driver's
All right.
license.
If there's a reasonable suspicion.
This is articulable reasonable suspicion. You just
Of
proved
what
it.
crime?
Trooper McLean claims that Mr. News could be arrested if he refused to provide his identification, and this is true under Section 40-5-29 of the Georgia Code. Additionally, Section 16-10-24 of the Georgia Code states that, quote, "A person who knowingly and willfully obstructs or hinders any law enforcement officer in the lawful discharge of his or her official duties shall be guilty of a misdemeanor." The statute also creates a separate felony offense for resisting, obstructing, or opposing a law enforcement officer, quote, "by offering or doing violence to the person of such officer." And in the 1989 case of Bailey versus State, the Court of Appeals of Georgia upheld a misdemeanor hindering conviction under this statute when an individual refused to provide identification to an officer during a traffic stop. However, it is important to keep in mind that if Mr. News was arrested under either of these statutes, he most likely could not be convicted if the initial stop was held to be unconstitutional. It is also worth mentioning that if this incident were to occur outside of the context of a traffic stop, Georgia law would not require Mr. News to identify himself. While Georgia does not have a stop and identify law that compels citizens to identify themselves to police officers during Terry stops, under Georgia's loitering statute, which is codified in Section 16-11-36 of the Georgia Code, officers can request that individuals suspected of loitering identify themselves. The statute states that, quote, "A person commits the offense of loitering or prowling when he is in a place, at a time, or in a manner not usual for law-abiding individuals, under circumstances that warrant a justifiable and reasonable alarm or immediate concern for the safety of persons or property in the vicinity. A law enforcement officer shall, prior to any arrest, afford the person an opportunity to dispel any alarm or immediate concern which would otherwise be warranted by requesting the person to identify himself and explain his presence and conduct." The statute also recognizes a citizen's refusal to identify themselves as a factor an officer can consider when deciding if alarm is warranted. However, it does not require individuals to identify themselves or authorize their arrest if they refuse to do so.
Of what crime? Whoa! Whoa! Simple battery. You just battered me, sir.
Step out here, because I've given you lawful commands.
And you have my ID.
Please
And
give-
you have my ID.
Please give your phone to your friend, and we're gonna step out here.
Okay, I'm stepping out. You don't need to manhandle me. I'm
I'm
stepping
not.
out.
How am I
Your
manhandling?
hand-
Step out.
Okay, I'm stepping
I'm
out.
not. I don't want you doing anything to put the vehicle in drive because I've had that happen before.
I'll shut it off.
All right, thank you.
I didn't even think of that. I apologize.
Step back
Okay,
here.
I'm stepping back.
After running Mr. News's driver's license, the officers eventually allowed Mr. News and Mr. Awesome to drive away without issuing a citation. After they left the scene, they traveled through the area again, turning around in another driveway next to the warden's home, and were not stopped by the officers. Overall, Trooper McLean and the Georgia State Patrol get a C, Because although it is possible their actions could be upheld as constitutional in a court of law, they admitted to detaining Mr. News for simply turning around in the warden's driveway and having an out-of-state license plate, and continued to detain him after any suspicion of criminal activity should have been dispelled. As Mr. News repeatedly reminded Trooper McLean throughout their interaction, knowing Mr. News' identity did not make turning around in a driveway more or less suspicious, and it seems clear that Trooper McLean wanted to run a warrant check on Mr. News, even if it was not justified. While courts do not consider an officer's subjective intentions to be relevant to the constitutionality of a traffic stop, they certainly are pertinent when assessing the morality of an officer's actions. And even though it is possible that a court would conclude that this detention did not violate the Fourth Amendment, if courts made such determinations based on the officer's subjective motivations for a stop, the same court would likely reach the opposite conclusion. This interaction demonstrates the disconnect that commonly exists between decisions in the courtroom and how police encounters actually play out in the real world, and the limitations of the judicial system as an avenue of recourse against police misconduct. Mr. News and Mr. Awesome get an A for maintaining a calm demeanor throughout the encounter, respectfully voicing his objections to the stop, and ultimately choosing to hand over his identification upon threat of arrest instead of escalating the situation. While it is possible a court could conclude that Mr. News was required to provide his driver's license to Trooper McLean, the reasons why Mr. News believed he did not need to provide it are more than understandable. This encounter is an excellent demonstration of how citizens can respectfully object to a police officer's actions while keeping themselves safe and avoiding arrest. And I encourage other auditors to learn from Mr. News' example. I commend Mr. News for remaining composed and respectfully asserting his rights. Be sure to give Rogue Nation and News Now South Florida your support. You can find a link in the description below. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out my second channel for even more police interaction content.